Let's say that you ordered a brand new car from the factory and all they sent you was just this little model car. Would you be very pleased? Let's discuss. So model car is cool and all. You can show your friends, you can display it on a shelf, but it can't do what an actual car can do. It can't get you from point A to point B and all the other things that a real car can do. So how does this question tie in with this week's lesson? Well, first, let's look at the memory text, which is found in this week's lesson, which we have a link down below. So be sure and click on that and follow along. But first, let's go to that memory text. So the memory text says, "Therefore he is the mediator of a new covenant, so that those who are called may receive the promised eternal inheritance." Now, the answer to that question of how that previous question ties in with this week's lesson, which is titled New Covenant Sanctuary. And how it ties in is that last week we looked at the Old Covenant and the New Covenant, and how the Old Covenant was foreshadowing the New Covenant. And so this week, we're going more in depth into what makes up the New Covenant. Sunday's lesson has an excellent verse that talks about God's intention for the Old Covenant and the New. It all ties in together. And Sunday's lesson is called Relationships. And here's the text. "And I will set my tabernacle among you, and my soul shall not abhor you, and I will walk among you, and will be your God, and ye shall be my people." So I want to highlight a couple different words here. Tabernacle and walk among you. Now, first, tabernacle is kind of an older word, an old English word that essentially just means to dwell with, or to really be with someone, to dwell in the same household, to live in the same household. And that was God's intention all along. He wants to be with us. He wants to be connected with us. And as I was reading it, it kind of made me think of how in Genesis, before the fall of Adam and Eve, how God used to walk with them in the cool of the evening, and how God wants to have a living, vital relationship with us. Which made me think of how, when you're in a loving relationship, you don't want to just send them text messages or emails. You want to actually spend time with them, in-person time. And that's what God wants. A lot of times the way that we connect with God is through the Bible, through written texts, if you will. But He wants to be able to connect with us beyond just that. That is very vital. It gives us an understanding of His character and what He wants for us. Now, another part of the Old Covenant that Monday talks about is animal sacrifice, and how that in and of itself was not sufficient to be able to forgive sins, to be able to cleanse a person from sin. And how the animal sacrifice was foreshadowing Christ's sacrifice. And it made me think of another foreshadowing that we see in the Old Testament that the Jewish people had, and all of God's people had, before Christ's sacrifice. And that was the story of Abraham and Isaac, when God called Abraham to sacrifice Isaac, and how that was an illustration of God the Father being willing to give up His Son in order to save us. And I would encourage you to read this passage in the Bible, this story of Abraham and Isaac. It's found in Genesis 22, 1 through 18, because another part of that story is significant for Tuesday's lesson, where Isaac asks Abraham where the sacrifice was, because Abraham had brought the fire and the wood, but there was no sacrifice. And Abraham's answer to Isaac is really key. He says, God will provide himself a sacrifice. And that is really foreshadowing how God's Son, Jesus, would be the substitute for us. Because, just a little spoiler to that story, Abraham does not sacrifice Isaac. But sacrifices were only part of what the Old Covenant was about and how it was foreshadowing the New Covenant. There was another element that was also very key to the Old and the New Covenant, and that is the priest. We will be combining Wednesday and Thursday's lesson because they both talk about the heavenly priestly order that Christ is doing. Now, the priest would sacrifice in the old system, in the old covenant, would sacrifice the lamb. And then the blood of that sacrifice would be used as a sign that the sin had been washed away. Well, in the new covenant, Jesus is also the high priest. He's the lamb and he is the high priest, the sacrifice and the mediator between us and God. And so right now, he is in the heavenly sanctuary representing us to God the Father. That his sacrifice is sufficient for all those who come to him and ask for forgiveness. And that brings us to Friday in the Further Thoughts section, where there's a really great Ellen White quote that I want to read for you. It says here, "The highest angel in heaven had not the power to pay the ransom for one lost soul. Cherubim and seraphim have only the power with which they are endowed by the Creator as his creatures. And the reconciliation of man to God could be accomplished only through a mediator who is equal with God, possessed of attributes that would dignify and declare him worthy to treat with the infinite God in man's behalf, and also represent God to a fallen world. Man's substitute and surety must have man's nature, a connection with the human family whom he was to represent, and as God's ambassador, he must partake of the divine nature, have a connection with the infinite, in order to manifest God to the world, and be a mediator between God and man." So I really hope that you guys enjoyed this week's lesson, and I would encourage you to, if you haven't followed along, to go back and read it, because there are a lot of great points that we didn't cover here. And I hope to see you again next week.